I've been posting videos about the best vintage lenses. Some of them are quite expensive, so I thought it might be helpful to post this video about more bargain basement M42 prime lenses. Lenses that cost less than around $50. And I'm not talking about finding a Leica lens in a house clearance sale for $10, although that would be nice. I'm talking about lenses that really don't cost a lot of money on the open market, but produce surprisingly good results. And of course these selections are based on my own experiences with M42 lenses. If you have other suggestions for bargain lenses you've used, please add them in the comments below. The irony of videos like this is that shedding light on lesser known vintage lenses can actually push up the price. And even as I post this video, you may find that some of the lenses I mention are on sale online for more than $50. But be patient, you should be able to find them cheaper. And there are some tips I can offer. Try looking for a poorly listed lens online, or a lens attached to a film camera, or a lens in the used section of a camera shop, or something you stumble across in a thrift shop or a car boot sale. Now it's important to point out that I'm not only talking about hidden gems here. To me a hidden gem is a lens that is as good as, if not better than modern lenses. It may not be better optically in terms of pixel peeping, but it renders images and colours and bokeh in an extraordinary way. Hidden gems can actually be quite expensive because while they're not very well known, enough people know how good they are to push the price up, and they can be quite rare. While many of the bargain lenses in this video are mass-produced, and often abandoned when people switch to digital cameras and their mobile phone. And a word about post-processing. The bargain lenses in this video all perform well on mirrorless and DSLR cameras, and they're a relatively cheap way of trying out prime lenses at specific focal lengths. But they may need quite a lot of post-processing to bring out the colours and the contrasts and adjust the lighting. I'm not going to pretend the images always look great straight out of camera. You've got to be prepared to play around with them. I'm going to look at lenses from fisheye and ultra-wide lenses all the way through to telephoto lenses. Starting with the fisheye lens category, I've searched and searched for good value, good performing vintage fisheyes. There are a number of M42 fisheyes to consider made by Fujinon, Zenitar, Takuma and others, and really there are no sub $50 lenses out there. Because of this, and because lens technologies for fisheyes have improved greatly since the film era, I've had more success buying modern primes and fisheye zooms. On the other hand, relatively cheap vintage wider angle lenses under 35mm are easier to find. Two decent bargain M42 lenses worth looking out for are made by Meyer Optic Görlitz, the Arrestagon 29mm 2.8 and the Lidith 30mm 3.5. I should mention that these Meyer Optic Görlitz lenses are also available in exact amounts. The exact amount can sometimes be a cheaper way to buy the lenses than the more popular M42 mount if you have the right adapter. Indeed, this Lidith is an exact amount lens, and I try to modify it by cementing on a M39 to M42 ring, not entirely successfully as the lens doesn't focus to infinity. But I believe that with the right adapter, the Lidith should focus to infinity on most digital cameras. These lenses are a good way to get into wide-angle focal range. My copy of the Arrestagon is not particularly strong stopped down as a landscape lens. It seems to lack contrast and the colours are quite muted, but for black and white landscapes in particular, the results can be very classy in a film-like way, more distinctive than the results from, say, a modern kit zoom. For closer-up shots, the two lenses get more interesting. On a crop sensor in particular, you're getting a focal length close to a classic 50mm equivalent. Both lenses produce fascinating bokeh. The preset Lidith especially, with its 10 blades, is a fun lens to use, and it's a cute size. However, if you're only using these lenses closer up, as a sort of surrogate fast 50, then there are better real fast 50s to buy. In terms of value for money and performance at the wider end, I'd spend a bit more money and buy something like a super multi-coated Takuma 28mm 3.5. The price of this particular lens goes up and down like a yo-yo. All I can say is that my copy costs less than $50, but it took a while to find one. It's worth the wait because this is a lovely little lens, sharp with great colours, especially in good light. Like all these vintage lenses, it benefits from a good hood, but the multi-coatings really do help to reduce flare or veiling and adds to the contrast. There are some much more expensive 20, 24 and 28mm film era lenses that are true hidden gems, but this Takuma is pretty good. I've separated out the 35mm lenses into their own category because this is a classic film era length, a good length for all kinds of shots, family portraits, walking around town, building and landscapes. I'm going to be quite blunt here and say straight out that unless you're willing to pay more than around $100 on a vintage 35mm lens, it may be better to stick with your digital camera's kit zoom if you have one. I've sold cheap old 35mm lenses such as the Helios, Vivitar and Paragon, simply because I didn't use them or bother taking them on holiday. The thing is, 25 to 35mm can be a real sweet spot for modern kit zooms. I've compared quite expensive vintage 35mm lenses with cheap kit zooms and found the kit zooms to be more than a match at 35mm. For example, this Sony crop sensor kit zoom. It doesn't have a strong reputation, to put it mildly, but I really can't fault it at around 25mm, where it's cropped to cover a similar area to a 35mm lens on full frame camera. If you are willing to spend around $100 or more on a vintage lens, then there are some great lenses to buy. Lenses like the Carl Zeiss Jena Flektogen f2.4, or the Super Multi-Coated Takuma f3.5, or the Yashica Yashinon 2.8, lenses that owners speak very highly of, or the amazing Auto Takuma 2.3, one of the best bokeh lenses I've ever used. The next category covers 36 to 49mm lenses, and there are some fine vintage lenses here, including 40mm Pancake lenses, although the best Pancake lenses are not M42 mount lenses. Away from the Pancakes, the Voigtlander 40mm f2 Ultron is a great M42 lens, but is hardly a bargain. A less expensive lens is the Carl Zeiss Tessa 40mm f4.5, but again it normally costs a lot more than $50. The Russian Mir 1 37mm f2.8 is an increasingly popular lens capable of artsy photos. It used to cost under $50, but it's become more expensive. It has some big fans. In fact, it's not easy to find bargains in this category. There is one Russian curiosity you can find online called the Lomo 40mm with an M42 mount. This lens has been taken off a Shmina camera and converted to a screw mount. Retro Photo House has made a great YouTube video about this lens. If you're looking for a Pancake lens, then at 50mm you could consider the cheap and cheerful Russian M42 Industar 50. It's 50mm f3.5 and a Tessa design. These lenses are tiny and they perform well, if a little quirky, and they look very neat on a digital camera. The Fast 50s category has loads of bargain M42 lenses. I'm going to cover 5 of them. And we have to begin with the Helios 44-2. In many people's views, this is one of the greatest value for money vintage primes. It may wobble a bit on some adapters. It may not take wonderful shots at infinity. The colours can be rather, how can I put it, oily, but it has some great strengths. It's centre sharp from the get-go wide open, surprisingly centre sharp, while its lack of sharpness away from the centre can add to an appealing 3D effect, and it can, in the right conditions, produce those magical swirls. Fortunately, it was built like a tank in large numbers, so it's easy and cheap to find, an almost must-have bargain vintage lens. My second choice Fast 50 is a famous older lens, the East German Carl Zeiss Jena Tessa 50mm 2.8. It's a slower Fast 50, but don't let that fool you. It's capable of really attractive smooth blur wide open. The Germans call this lens the Eagle Eye, and it's sharp and gets even sharper stopped down. It's just a great optical design, and it doesn't typically cost a lot of money to buy. There are different versions, and I went for the cheapest non-zebra version. A piece of history for not a lot of money. My third choice Fast 50 is the Auto Takuma 55 f2.2. I love this lens. I'm a huge fan of the 55 1.8s as well, but there's something else about the Auto version with its cocking lever. From the outside it looks just like the Auto Yashinon 50mm f2, a highly rated lens, but here the similarity ends. The Takuma has 10 blades rather than the Yashinon's 6, and the rendering, especially wide open, is different. What's so special about the Takuma is it produces the most gorgeous painterly bokeh and colours. I find the Yashinon a little less dreamy. Stop down, both of these lenses are very good, but the Takuma is the winner for me, and it tends to be a lot cheaper. Indeed, until the last year or two, it was ridiculously cheap, and still turns up at a bargain price occasionally. By the way, there's an f2 version as well, and it doesn't seem to be much different to me. My next bargain Fast 50 out of many I can mention is one I can't leave off the list because it's such a good lens. It's the Mare Optic Girless Oriston 50mm 1.8 Zebra version. There's also a later rebranded Pentagon version. I've owned both lenses and both are excellent. I kept the Oriston because I like the zebra look, and the lens gets some rave reviews here on YouTube. The Oriston's sharpness and bokeh is really good. One big advantage is that it focuses quite close, less than a foot away. Great for stressing the wonderful bubble bokeh it produces. The colours can be rather muted, but they respond well to processing. It's a lens well worth checking out, and it's great value for money. It has one of the most irritating stop-down buttons, but that's a story for another video. There's one other bargain fast 50 lens I'd like to mention here. Perhaps not to directly recommend it, because it has radioactive glass, and not everyone is keen on radioactive lenses. But if you think they're safe to use in moderation, and you'd like to try a relatively cheap radioactive lens, then this could be the one. It's this Yashica Auto Yashinon DS 50mm 1.7. Not the DS-M or the DX, but the DS. I've seen this lens sell regularly for less than $50. It was made by Tomioka, a maker with a strong, almost cult reputation. The DS seems to have slipped the net, as other Yashicas sell for much more. I don't know whether I just got lucky with my copy, but I really enjoy the way this lens renders. When I've posted side-by-side snaps from different lenses, people have often picked the photo taken with the Yashica. In the macro lens category, like the fisheyes, it's hard these days to find cheap vintage lenses, and they merit their prices as there are some excellent lenses on the list. My advice is to use other equipment with normal lenses to get good macro-micro shots, and I've already posted a video about this on YouTube, covering M42 bellows, extension tubes, reversing rings and magnifiers. In that video, for example, I showed how sharp the Tessa could be on bellows. Onto portrait lenses, and again these lenses, especially the M42 85mm lenses, are expensive and hardly bargain basement. The good news, especially for crop sensor users, is that fast 50s at 75mm equivalent are perfectly good portrait lenses, as are 135mm lenses. I'd also like to introduce a note of caution here. I'm surprised at how many people have purchased an expensive vintage 85mm and they don't use it very much. I'm not talking about professional portrait photographers who are active users of 85mm lenses. I'm talking about part-time photographers who take a lens out for a walk and don't take a lot of portraits. They seem to find the 85mm too long for interesting close-up shots, not as useful as a fast 50, and 85mm is not long enough for other types of shots. So a 135mm gets more use. If you're lusting after an expensive vintage 85mm lens, it's a good idea to think about how you use it, and its pros and cons versus an excellent fast 50, for example. I know a narrow depth of field is one advantage, but it's not everything. Anyway, that's just an observation. You may disagree. If you'd like a cheap option at these focal lengths, you could of course go for a vintage zoom. For instance, this Vivitar 75 to 205mm close focus zoom will do a perfectly good job, and it can even do smooth bokeh to help isolate your subject. Another way around the cost issue is to adapt a projector lens. You'll need something to mount the projector lens onto the camera, and I use this 36 to 90mm adjustable helicoid. And then you can enter the wonderful world of projector lenses. My favourite is this Lights Color Plan 95mm 2.5. Checking eBay, to be fair, it's not the cheapest option you can buy today. Just a couple of years ago it cost far less than $50, and occasionally somebody has it on sale as a bargain. A cheaper alternative might be the Pentagon 80mm 2.8 projector lens. I like the color plan for two main reasons. Firstly, it's a Leica, and it's nice to say you own Leica glass. Secondly, it lives up to its name and produces great colours and sharp but dreamy images, perfect for portraits. I have to warn you, it's a bit of a lottery adapting projector lenses. You won't have any aperture control, and some lenses work better than others. You can have problems making them focus to more than a few feet away, but that can be enough for a tight headshot. It's certainly an option to consider. Now on to 135mm lenses. There are some really excellent M42 mount lenses in this category, most notably the multi-bladed Bokeh monsters, but they are becoming expensive. The question that needs to be asked is, what does a Bokeh monster actually mean in practice? If it's wide open bokeh you're after, then the number of blades is irrelevant. On the other hand, if by Bokeh monster you mean great bokeh stop down, then the number of blades can make a big difference. Focusing on wide open bokeh, there are two good value lenses I can easily recommend. Firstly, the Carl Zeiss Sona 135 f3.5 Zebra version. For the cost of the lens, the results are impressive. You can see the images online. And the other bargain to me is this one, the Pentagon 135mm 2.8 with 6 blades. It's a sibling to the more expensive Pentagon 15-bladed version. You'll probably be using it wide open most of the time, where it produces just as good a result as the more expensive lens. I especially like the sharpness and the colours after a bit of processing. Stop down, it gets even sharper, although the bokeh gons can be a little intrusive. Finally, onto telephoto lenses. There are plenty of M42 mount options in this category, and some are cheap enough to buy just for the fun of trying them, like I did with this Japanese Optomax 300mm 5.6. The images from the lens are certainly not going to make National Geographic, but at least you can see if you like a particular telephoto focal length as a prime, and if you do, you could consider buying a more expensive lens. There is one telephoto I'd like to spotlight, the super multi-coated Takuma 200mm f4. The lens is often for sale online, complete with the hood and case, all solid metal and glass. I'm sure this was quite a costly lens when it was first made, but not anymore. It's a lot of lens for the low price it can sell for. It's not as good as the earlier 18-bladed 200mm 3.5, but that's an exceptional lens by any standard. I've done a separate video on that lens. It's much more expensive these days than this later f4. The f4 only has 6 blades and suffers somewhat from purple fringing, and it can be a little soft wide open. However, if you use a good solid base or a tripod, it's a good performer in its own right, all the way to astro work. So that's my run through some of the bargain M42 mount lenses I've come across and used. It would be great if you could add your own favourite bargains in the comments below. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please do, and I'll be producing some more videos and reviews of vintage lenses.